Hello, everybody, and welcome. I originally was going to be doing the welcome tonight, but luckily and unexpectedly, luckily for all of us, Eileen Stillwagon has returned from Nigeria, and so she is going to maintain our tradition of introducing the speaker series, and then Linus will introduce our speakers. So thank you all very much for coming.
Well, I guess that is true. Luckily, I did come back from Nigeria. And it was a wonderful fall break. Okay, thank you all very much for participating in the 5th annual Dr Gondwe Memorial Lecture on Social and Economic Justice. I'd like to welcome back our speaker, Dr. Mwangi Wa Githinji, Sarah Gondwe, and Jessica and Javon, members of the Gondwe family. Here at the 5th lecture, 6 years since we lost Derek, it's hard to picture that none of the students here ever had the wits scared out of them by going into Derek's office to ask a question. And of course, if you got to know Derek, you'd find out that the scarier he was, that meant the more he liked you. And he would just be so grim. But once you got to know him, that was quite endearing. So we're very grateful for the ongoing support and affection of the William and Gail Kiefer family for their endowment of the series. We also thank the Departments of Economics and Africana Studies, Derek's 2 departmental homes at Gettysburg, for their ongoing support for the series, as well as the college Events Planning Board for their support. I hope you're enjoying the slides that have been up here to give you a glimpse of Derek and his family and his home country, Malawi, the University of Malawi Chancellor's College, where Derek taught as a Fulbright Senior Scholar when he first had a chance to return home after many years of exile. But I might point out a couple of things. That's a hard job. Keep studying, students. I'm up on my toes here because I can't reach the mic. That's the Shire River south of Lake Malawi. That's on the shores of Lake Malawi. Beautiful waters and sands. I want to show you, that's Chancellor College at, in Zomba in Malawi. That's the economics department. Those are 3 colleagues of Derek when he was at the economics department. And people selling things along the road. Okay. In organizing this series of lectures, we're very fortunate that Derek had many friends, and among those friends are quite a few renowned economists. The first Gondwe lecture was given by Professor William Sandy Darity of University of North Carolina and Duke University. The second Gondwe lecture was delivered by Honorable Dr Gondwe, then Minister of Finance of the Republic of Malawi. In the 3rd year, we were very pleased to introduce another friend of Derek, Dr. Thandika Mkandawire, Director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. He's now retired from UN and he's at London School of Economics. Dr. Mkandawire knew Derek and Goodall in Malawi, and they were vocal in the movement for Malawian independence, which meant that they had left to pursue their education, and they found that the political situation made it impossible for them to return to Malawi because of their activism. Last year, Ambassador Shirley Barnes brought a much-needed spotlight to the problem of human trafficking. And this year, Professor Aquinas Nwugo of Economics and Africana Studies will introduce another economist in this tradition, whom we're welcoming back to Gettysburg. I'd also like to recognize the Gondwe scholars this year. We're fortunate to have 3 Gondwe scholars, Dr. Kwame Essien of History and Africana Studies, Jennifer Gale Gallardo of Anthropology, and Jeruvia Jones of Film Studies. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for coming. Our speaker today is Dr. Wa Githinji. He is certainly not new to many of you here because he was here just a few years back. Even for those of us who just met him, we already knew a few things about him, and one of them is that when he was here, he set the bar very high. Well, you may ask, how do I know? I will tell you, early this year, somebody, we were having a chat with somebody, and Jennifer was there. What the person said was, "Oh, so you are the new Mwangi." And Jenny was very quick to say, "Oh, no, not so fast." That was not because she was wrong, it's the fact that she was so right. That means you set a very high bar for us, and we are grateful that you showed us the way. Dr. Githinji is a native of Kenya. He obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Economics at the City College of New York in 1989. He then moved to the University of California, Riverside, where he obtained his Master's of Art in Economics in 1991. And in 1997, he obtained his PhD. As a graduate student, he worked as a researcher for various organizations, including the University of York in England, where he took part in the Darwin Project as a research assistant, studying the economic consequences and causes and consequences of biodiversity loss in sub-Saharan Africa. He has consulted widely with the United Nations and other organizations on development issues, and he was also formerly an associate professor of economics and coordinator of Africana studies here at Gettysburg College. Currently, he is assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, which is my alma mater. He is also the author of 10 Millionaires and 10 Million Beggars, a study of inequality and development in Kenya. He is also the co-author of Employment Targeted Plan for Kenya, in addition to numerous articles and chapters. His research interests political economy, development, and environment, with particular focus on the issues of class, gender, income distribution in relation to transition in Africa. It's a pleasure to have you back, and I hope you will enjoy your time while you're here.
Thank you. Now let's see if I can remember what I was told to do here. Good evening. I miss that. I miss that greeting. And it's really nice. It's a privilege to be back. It's an honor to give this lecture, because as many of you who were here then know, Derrick was very dear to me as he was to many of us. I'm very happy to be here, with Derrick's family, and to share with you some work I'm working on, work which fit in with many of Derrick's interests. As you know, as many of you know, Derrick taught here for 27 years, and Derrick was always on the side of the marginalized, but you know, he wasn't loud about it like some of us are. He was just persistent and quietly and in a dignified manner on the side of those who did not have what many of us have had access to. And in many ways, he took this same temperament to his teaching of economics and his approach to economics. And he did this always with a dose of humor. Eileen was talking about students, worrying about Derrick. Derrick would always tell them that he's going to examine the contents of their cranium with a baseball bat and see what's in there. But it was always in good humor. And while I was here, I came across this, and some of you have heard this before, but one of the things that a student wrote back after Derrick's passing, and he said this of his course, and this was from the 90s. Throughout the course, Derrick, would share many stories about his little sausage of a country, Malawi. He would always tell us of the political and economic corruption in the government of his country. And it was very clear from the sadness of his eyes how he felt. Michael Lutyens, another student in class, and myself would often tell Professor Gondwe that he should go back and run for president and change the corruption. He would always laugh and make a joke about why he never wanted to be president. The day of the final exam, Mike and I made t-shirts as a joke that said Gondwe for president and wore them to the exam. When he walked in, he took one look at us and tears came to his eyes. And he laughed and said, "You chaps will have to do better than that to get a good grade in the exam." So, that's a kind of person he was. And as an economist, he approached economics in the same manner. I pulled this out of his book, Political Economy, Ideology, and the Impacts of Economics on the Third World. And I'm just going to leave it up there. I won't necessarily read it. But, his focus was to take economics from its abstract nature and make it more holistic, go back to its roots, go back to its political economy roots. And for me, who works in the same vein, it was great to come here, coming from a school which worked in that vein, but knowing that most of the economics profession doesn't work in that vein. So to come here and find a fellow traveler was great. But it was more than that, because there's a certain amount of honesty that Derrick brought to this that I don't bring. Because Derrick came to this later in life, right? Derrick, and people may have not talked of him this way, and Derrick was privileged. He came from a leading family. His friends like Tandika Mkandawira, who was at UNRIST, David Rubadiri, who was a chancellor later on at the university, his brother, who was Minister of Finance. I'm not saying they were rich, but he was privileged. He came from leaders of Malawi. Derrick did not have to rebel against the system. He could have taken a much easier path, right? He didn't have to knock heads with his own brother, who worked for a long time at the World Bank, where Derrick disagreed with it. And Derrick was also trained classically as a mainstream economist. But it was his examination of actually what was going on in the so-called third world, right? That in the late 80s, during the time the wall was falling down, that Derrick turned fully this corner and really questioned the tenets of economics, right? So he was someone who came to this honestly. And I say, unlike some of us who, were in some sense luckier in that we came across it in a different manner, at an earlier age where maybe we didn't question it as much. So there's a great deal, I have a great deal of respect for his coming honestly to this position. And it's something I always remember about him. Today I'm going to talk on inequality, development, and growth, a topic that was dear to Derrick's heart, a topic we actually did some work together on, looking at inequality in Malawi during the 80s, during the regime of Banda. And we did early work that pointed out to inequality increasing at a time when it was difficult to actually get data, and we had to do it via a deconstruction of the national accounts. My focus will be more on this, why inequality is a problem structurally rather than the moral issues around inequality, which along with Derrick, I share the moral concerns about inequality. But today I want to focus on why inequality is an impediment to development as we traditionally see development. Okay. Now, the traditional view in economics was that there was a growth and equality trade-off. You open up the first text, the first few pages of an econ textbook, and in most of them it's still there that there's this trade-off between growth and equality, right? Growth is about efficiency. Looking at growth is a positive. If we do this as a positive science, while equality is normative and, you know, it's not really a positive, it's not part of the positive part of the discipline. It's something you have as a normative value. And then most of them, at least in the past, it's getting a little bit better. In the past, then we forgot about issues of equality and we went into growth and efficiency, and much of economics is built around that. So in the traditional view, there was this growth equality trade-off. A lot of it came to be particularly because of the work of four great economists, Kuznets, Arthur Lewis, Keynes, and Kaldor. Kuznets in the 50s pointed out empirically that rich countries let me start with poor countries were highly equal, and then as they got richer, they became slightly more unequal. And then once they got richer again, they became more equal. And there was kind of this idea that you would be willing to pay for equality once you had the money. You could afford the largesse, in a sense, once you had the money. Lewis, on the other hand, was looking at development and how do you develop when you have what he called unlimited supplies of labor, which simply meant that you had a lot of people in the rural sector and in the informal sector engaged in activities in a manner in which if you took one person off from the activity, because there are more than enough people to do the activity, you could still produce as much. So there was no cost from removing a person from the rural sector going to the formal sector. And for him, this was a way for development to take place because it meant that you could have relatively low wages and no loss of production as you moved to a capitalist economy. The implication of this was also that it wasn't a problem if you had inequality initially as you transferred national income to the capitalists, because in fact they would create more jobs. And in fact, that's what you wanted to occur, right? You wanted the people in the formal capitalist sector to get the income where they would create more jobs. And you didn't want it to go into either landowners or bureaucrats who would tend to consume the wealth. Then from Keynes and Kaldor came the ideas about marginal propensity to save. The idea that if you look at people across different income classes, those who are wealthier will save a larger proportion of their income, right? Because every extra dollar for a poor person might be needed for direct consumption, whereas once you've covered your basic needs, then every extra dollar you get, you can use for savings and therefore then investment. So in that world, inequality was not necessarily problematic because it could lead to growth. There were challenges at least from development economics. And I lay out 3 challenges that early development economics laid out. One was that in an unequal country, you would get demand for goods which weren't produced in the country. I.e., if a country was highly unequal, you get the phenomena which in Africa is called wabenzi. So people who go out and buy Mercedes Benzes, right? So if you have a few people with high amounts of wealth, they will demand goods which are imported, which means they're not making demands on local production, right? Whereas if you had a different distribution, let's say you had that money then distributed to hundreds or thousands of poorer people, these folks would be demanding basic goods which could be produced in the country. So in a sense, having a more equal distribution would lead to more industrialization because you could get basic goods going. You would also have, there was also the challenge that lower levels of human capital were associated with inequality. And human capital being basically education, skills and training. And there were two bits to this argument. One was the fact that if you have a single person with much of the wealth, there's only so much education and training that they can get, right? Versus if that money was distributed to a broader group of people who could then acquire more education and training. The other part of this was the wealthy, because they depended on the lower income folks for work, might be against actual improvements in human capital because it would affect wages, right? It would affect demand for higher income. And you still find this phenomena, particularly in places often quoted is Pakistan, where landlords actually will work against, acquisition of human capital because of the impacts it has on wages for them. And of course, political instability, that high inequality would breed political instability. In the 90s, new challenges to the idea that there was a growth inequality trade-off took place primarily because of the bringing together of a new data set on inequality. Inequality is relatively difficult to actually measure well. And most of the time we use what's called the Gini coefficient, and I won't bore you with the details of what it is, but it's basically a range in your population from lowest income to highest income. And countries that are fairly equal will have a Gini coefficient close to 0, and countries that are highly unequal will have a Gini coefficient closer to 100. Now, what occurred in the 90s, around 96, was a long-term data set from about 1896 to 1996 was put together by a group of researchers at the World Bank. And from that came a series of papers looking at inequality and growth. And lo and behold, many of these empirical papers found that actually countries that were more equal at the beginning of their processes of development grew faster, right? And once they found that, then, in a little while, we found what the reasons were for this, and I'll discuss them as I discuss the African-specific ones. And then, of course, in the last 50 years, there's been a challenge to the view that inequality is bad because of the success of the most recent, the newly industrialized countries. And here I have Taiwan, South Korea, now China, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and Finland. And all these countries, what's interesting about them is they all took off after a large redistribution program, mostly in land, although in the case of Singapore and Malaysia, the redistribution took place in different ways. But in these other cases, it was in land And whereas the old story would have been, you redistribute, therefore you're going to lower the average, marginal propensity to save, and therefore reduce the investment funds and therefore reduce growth. In fact, what happened in these countries, these are the countries that grew the fastest. So as we started having this history, the old views were challenged. In the African case, more recently there's been, I'm forgetting to move you. There's been a series of studies that have looked at inequality and its impact on Africa, and it fits in with the rest of the views that we find. That one, it decreases it decreases the ability of growth to reduce poverty, right? And everybody, much of the new development has been about poverty alleviation. So in fact, nowadays people talk about pro-poor growth, right? Trying to figure out a growth that actually affects the poorest in the communities. It lowers literacy and therefore growth, and along with lowering literacy, of course, is that lowering literacy also leads to larger families. Okay, so there in fact two effects. There are lower investments in education, like other places in the world, and it lowers investment rates due to perceived risks, people worried about stability. And this is interesting because it's not instability itself that lowers the investment, but just a perception that there will be instability because there is inequality. So you can have a country that has been peaceful, but if there is talk, if there's a feeling that the inequality might lead to instability, it's not the actual instability, but prior to that, the perception of it. And more recently, it's been found it also prolongs the longevity of the informal sector. And I'll come back to this because this is important for what I'm going to discuss. So first of all, let's take a quick look at inequality in Africa, okay? Now this data is from the data set, so it will only run till 1996. As I mentioned, the Gini runs from 0 to 100. So our range is a Gini of 12.1 to a high of nearly 80. So that's a range for all the countries there, 2,600 observations. Now what's interesting here is if you look at the African range, which is from 1914 to 1996, it is from 25 to 79.5. So that the lowest African country is not necessarily anywhere close to the lowest from any other region. And of course, the highest African country is well above any other country. So contrary to what is normally said about inequality, which is a focus on Latin America and the large degree of inequality in Latin America, a large part of Africa is much less equal than Latin America, okay? So a large part of Africa. And here at the bottom, I have a series of countries for which there's a decent number of data points. So I dropped in which had just a few data points so we could get so you didn't think that it was just a biased sample. And as you'll note, many of these countries, Kenya and South Africa start close to 50 and go nearly all the way to 70. The highest is not in this list, but the highest is Zambia. This is a measure from Zambia, which is the highest in the world, at least in this period, okay? Of the first 11 measures of inequality, of the top 11 measures of inequality across this period, 6 are from Kenya, okay? So that gives you some idea about how unequal these countries are. Right? Now, these measures that many of these African countries have, so measures starting above 48, and well, let's say about 45, if you take the entire data set, these measures are consistent with the top 10% getting at least 50% of the income, right? Now, it's not a fixed relationship, but just in terms of these measures, if you look at the countries here, the distribution here is consistent with the top 10% getting at least 50% of the income, and in some cases, even higher. And with the bottom 20% often getting less than 3-4% of the total income. Okay? So this is where you have this phenomena that I called of wabenzi. So you arrive in an African capital, you know, you will find the most, what Mazrui calls a facade of a Western skyline, where he can't tell where he is. Is he in Africa or is he in Europe? But in many ways it's a facade, because it's a front. Once you get behind it, the vast population is much poorer. Okay, is much poorer. Now, why is it the case that African countries have this high inequality? Now, let me caution, there are 53 African countries. So obviously I'm generalizing a bit here. So my story is not going to fit exactly for every country, but it will fit, I would argue it would fit for a large number, and for most with some changes. Okay? Part of the explanation has to do with Africa's most recent reintroduction into the global economy. And here I mean the introduction that occurs in the 19th century with colonialism, when the modern African sector as we know it today gets constructed. Okay? And what we end up with are three main sectors. We have the formal sector, which is our market-based modern economic sector that we would recognize, okay? And that's where productivity is relatively high, where wages relative to the rest of the country are high, but which tends to be very small, okay? Then we have two big sectors, an agricultural sector, which is often dominated in terms of employment, not in terms of output, but in terms of employment, by small-scale farmers in the past who were called subsistence farmers. It's not always the case today that they're subsistence farmers, but people with small acreage. In the Kenyan case, for example, often less than 2.5 acres per household. Okay? They're characterized by a low use of inputs and poor infrastructure and extension services. Okay? Along with this, due to rural-urban migration, we have a large informal sector. And the informal sector is mostly found in the urban areas, but increasingly also in the rural areas. It's basically what people do to make a living, whether it be selling, you know, fruit, cutting up fruit and selling it by the side of the road, selling used clothing. But there are all these non-formal activities where, given the lack of any other mechanism, if you fail to find a job in the formal sector, then you figure out how to survive, right? And in many cases, they do very inventive, very wonderful things, but it's characterized by low wages, low income, okay? And it's always kind of a holding stage for the formal sector, i.e., the vast majority of people, given a choice, would leave the informal sector for the formal. Now, there are some people who do very well in the informal sector, okay? But the vast majority would leave it for the formal. And because it exists, there has also been an informalization of previously formal jobs. What do I mean by this? I mean that because there's this large pool of labor, it has now become practice for people to stop giving formal contracts and treat people. So the formal sector, for example, will now start employing people on short-term basis. So they don't get a full contract, they don't get the benefits that goes along with it. So there's both the informal sector and an informalization of jobs. So in terms of employment, there are people who are in the informal sector and there are people in informal jobs. Now, one of the things that has occurred is that the formal sector, which is very small and looks in many ways, very much like the modern sector in the West, basically is a capital-intensive driven operation, or relatively capital-intensive driven operation. So people, entrepreneurs there will tend to use more capital than labor, right? And therefore, it doesn't create that many jobs, right? But yet it accounts for a large part of total output in the economy, although not total employment, okay? So if you look at many African countries, you'll often find that the capital city will account for up to 50% of GDP, right? Well, while accounting for about maybe, if in a country with a mega city, maybe 10% of population. And if you think of the population that's actually in the formal sector, it's going to be much smaller. So you have relatively highly capital intensive firms producing much of production, but with very few jobs, okay? Now, to give you a feeling of how this has changed over time, in 1972 in Kenya, 1 in 4 urban Kenyans had access to a formal job, i.e. there was 1 job for every 4 urban Kenyans, okay? In the rural areas, it was 1 to 25, okay? Now, what has happened over time is actually, by 2007, only 1 in 8 had access to a formal job, and in the rural areas, 1 in 34, right? So there's more competition for these jobs. This formal employment as a proportion of total employment, in fact, in many ways, is smaller, okay? So what this pushes is relatively high incomes in this formal sector against the backdrop of an expanding small-scale sector and rural sector in which wages stagnate and income stagnate because of that large supply of labor. Okay. What I'm going to do, we don't need to get into this other than for some of our friends, but I'll just leave it up for a second so that they can say at least there was an economics presentation, and then we'll move on. Brendan, no questions after this, okay? Okay, so what I'm going to do is simple, is actually show this by looking at how much growth changes employment in the formal sector, right? So what I try to do in the case of Kenya as an example is calculate the gross elasticity of employment, which is what does 1% change of growth, what impact does it have in percentage terms on employment, okay? And then I'll use the answer of that elasticity to simulate what growth might do to employment in the African context, okay? And the two numbers, the number you need to look at, in the case of Kenya, I look at this for both male, female, and regional, and urban, rural, but we can concentrate on one number, which is the 0.67. So a 1% change in growth leads to a 0.67 change in percent change in formal employment. Okay? And you will find that generally your gross elasticity of employment is generally should be less than 1, because normally your employment, you employ people if they're more productive than the last person, right? So if you're employing someone who's more productive than the last person, right, your change in output will be greater, right? So it's generally going to be less than 1. And this is going to be important for when we think about Africa in general. Okay, so what I do is then I look at the case of Kenya, and I look at a recent survey, which was done in 2006. And one of the problems we have with African economies is that, in fact, data is fairly difficult to come across. National surveys are not often done for various reasons, or when done, the data is not released. So, and I use the 3 main sectors we've talked about: a formal sector, an informal sector, and a rural, which represents a smallholder sector, right? And I'm just going basically through the story I've told you. The formal sector is a preferred sector. People get out of school, and what they want to do is get a job in the formal sector where wages are higher. The other sectors really are a reserve pool of labor, okay? Now, I'm doing this study in the context of Kenya's aims to be a middle income country by 2030. So it has put out this plan where it says, look, if we grow at 10% per year, at least in terms of average income, we will be a middle income country. Now, the question is, will that average income will other characteristics of the country coincide with being a middle income country? Okay? So that's what I'm looking at in this case. Okay? And because, again, of the limitation of data, I will make assumptions along the way. And in all cases, I've tended to err on the side of saying that the growth will occur, the growth will produce the maximum number of employment, etc. So I've erred on the side of being generous to this idea that growth will lead to moving towards a middle income country. Okay? And so what I do is I look at the labor force, which is 13.5 million in a population of now 40 million. Now again here, remember that many African countries, 50% of the population is under 16, right? So it's a young population. And on average, you have 71.5% participation rate, i.e. people who are in the labor force, who are either out there working or looking for work, are on average 71.5% from the 2006 data. And this has held pretty much across different surveys in Kenya. It's fairly high. Again, you're talking about a situation where there's no alternative. If you don't work, unless you're wealthy, you don't really have much of an alternative. There isn't a large state-provided safety net. At this time, the unemployment was calculated as 10.4%, which for a very poor country, people wonder, you know, it seems a little low since given how poor the country is. But an interesting fact is this: we looked at this 10.4%. Most of these were people with degrees, who are a very small group of the population. It seemed clear that there were people who could afford to be unemployed while they waited for the perfect kind of job. So it wasn't the same kind of unemployment that we have. In fact, countries like this are characterized a lot more by underemployment, where people are working, but working at a status far below what they're qualified to do. 50% of the employed were smallholders, right? And 35% were in the informal sector, okay? Now, for purposes of my simulation, I will hold the 71.5% constant and also this 10.4% unemployment rate. Now, we could let that vary, but all you would show is a growing unemployment, right? So I just hold it constant here. So what do? What we do is we take those figures that I pointed out that we started with, right? And we calculate if you have 10% growth from 2006, right? What will be the formal employment? How many people will be formally employed, right? Remember, as this is going along, the labor force itself is growing. And here, the Kenyan labor force has been growing at about 2% per year. So that's growing as as we move along. And the basic story, what you find is even early on, in fact, because so few jobs are being created, the formal employment as a percent of total employment is actually falling, right? As I had mentioned earlier. And it's only later on, after some 5 or so years of 10% growth. And let's put this in context. Only one country in the world which has more than 2 million people has grown at 10% for the period, the kind of period that the Kenyan government is stating it wants to grow at 10%, right? Everybody knows who that is, right? China, right? Only China has managed to do this. Okay, so the 10% growth itself is really large. A more realistic, fast growth would be 6%. But again, not questioning that, if they were able to do that, given the structure of the economy, after 10 years, the formal sector would only be slightly larger in percentage terms, in terms of employment, from what it is today, right? And what I'm calling the reserve labor will only be slightly smaller, okay? So in numbers, you would actually need 750,000 jobs in the first year in Kenya, in the formal sector, to absorb everybody who's coming out of school if they aren't to go into these other sectors. And by the end, in the 10th year, you'd need 897. At the maximum capacity, a growth of 10% in the Kenyan context will only create 180,000 jobs. Okay? So you have this huge shortfall in terms of jobs in the formal sector vis-a-vis these other two sectors. So what are we going to get? What we're going to get is what I've called the reserve labor will continue to grow, which will mean, as all of you remember, supply increases. If the supply of labor increases, what you'd expect is wages will be lower, so wages will be suppressed in these other sectors. And in fact, will come back and also suppress wages in the formal sector, because the pool that the employers are taking the people out of is the same. And so if the informal sector ends up having lower wages, that starts translating also into the formal sector. This is the same exercise, just using a slightly different elasticity, which was the private sector employment elasticity, which was worked slightly faster. So I do this in the context to show whether you're using both public and private sector elasticities, or just a private sector elasticity, which is working a little faster, you still end up with pretty much the same outcome. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you say that the market and the private sector will actually be the lead, or it's a combination of public and private, we still end up in the same situation. Okay. I follow this with a little bit of a simulation, again with very unreal assumptions. Assumptions about growth in income for these sectors which I know would not hold out, right? In terms of wages in the informal sector and in the rural sector. But I do this to point out that even under the most favorable assumptions, your formal sector wages grow the fastest, and your rural income and your informal sector do not grow as fast, right? So you're going to, in the minimum, in a static sense, have this gap also between the formal sector and the informal sector. Now, the other part of this, which I'll mention later, but we can preview, is that if wages are being suppressed, it means that most likely payments to capital are being increased, right? So profits are being increased, right? So in that sense, the folks, the employers in the formal sector would be getting an even bigger piece of the pie. Okay? Now, you might think that this is a case that applies to Kenya, but I just wanted to give you a feel. If I put this up on the board and ask people who know something about Africa, I think many people would agree that, yes, there's a large number of countries who have about 70% of their employment in agriculture, 20% in the informal, and 10% in the formal. And I do a simple exercise here which follows the other exercise. Suppose I was to assume that you have growth with zero productivity. Okay, the growth that I showed in the Kenyan case had increases in productivity, i.e. every new person produced more than the last person. So a 1% increase in output would lead to a less than 1% increase in employment. Suppose I said, let's get rid of that constraint and just say every percentage change in growth will have an equal percentage change in employment. So it will be equivalent to zero productivity growth, right? And take the same 2% growth in labor force, which is actually in many countries higher, right? In fact, Kenya's has dropped relative to many African countries, so in many cases would be higher than this. And you go through a generic example, right? And here I use a 6% rate of growth, which has been kind of the high average for African countries most recently. So they've gone through this period where they've had rather rapid growth from 2000 or from about 1998, and 6% has been on the side of the average. And even with this, look at this, our reserve labor moves only from 90% to 86% of the labor force during this period, right? And the actual numbers are increasing, right? So if you add these two numbers, these two are increasing. So it's 9 million here, and here it's 10.3. So the numbers are increasing even though the percentage is getting smaller. So it doesn't change for what I'm calling the generic African country. Now, if you actually use an elasticity that's more likely, and we don't have many calculations of the elasticity, but I use here Kenya and South Africa, the average of those two, and it's about 0.55. If you use that, then the situation is even worse. So over 10 years, 90% of the labor force is in the reserve at the beginning. It only goes down to 89%. Again, the actual numbers themselves are growing. Okay? So what's the story here? What's the implications of these results? The obvious one, not enough jobs are being created in the formal sector, right? There's also this increased inequality due to downward pressure on wages. And then this gap between wages and profits, as profits become a larger part of national income than other payments, right? There's also this that occurs, and this I also did one on women. You're going to get an increase in women's employment, which on the face of it looks good, but also you find that women are going to be segregated in lower paying jobs, and in fact, the more they're pulled in, the lower those wages are, okay, because there's this downward pressure. importantly, in the case of Kenya, and also in the case of many African countries, regional differences will either be stable or grow. One of the big issues that faces many African countries is the large regional differences within countries in terms of equality because of the nature of where the formal sector is. It is either dominated in an urban area, or it's in a mining sector or a plantation agricultural sector. And this is geographically distinct from other parts of the economy, right? So this often feeds into regional differences in income inequality. In fact, I would argue this is the biggest reason, right, why you have what people call, people don't call it ethnic, they say tribal differences, but which are ethnic differences. It's the biggest reason why one has ethnic differences in Africa, is particularly in agricultural countries, but in other countries as well. There's a coincidence between agroecology and ethnic community, and therefore if you end up with an agricultural sector which is dominated by tea and coffee, for example, and tea and coffee grows in a particular area, right, what you get is also an ethnic difference in income, right? Now from the outside it's easy for us to see the ethnic difference, right? But what the difference might be, it might be a tea and coffee farmer issue versus peasants, right? Or it might be workers in a mining economy versus other people. What we would describe as class income differences get conflated with ethnic differences in the African context. Of course, these ethnic differences then take a life of their own, right? So you now have a situation where those now start having a life of their own. And urban employment continues to outpace rural. I also looked at the difference between urban and rural. And this means you're going to have increased pressure on land. So you're going to get redivision of land. In many African countries, holdings are becoming extremely small as fathers further subdivide their land to ensure that mostly their sons have access to some economically productive asset, right? And you get an increased migration to the urban areas, which means an increased informal sector. Okay? So how does this fit in with the story of what's going on in Africa right now? Okay? Presently in Africa, there's a lot of hope that this increase in growth that we've seen since '98, and it's been tremendous actually. It's an increase in growth which has not been seen since the period between 1960 and 73, when Africa at that period also grew extremely fast. We often forget that, but post-independence, for the first 15 years, Africa grew extremely fast, and this period is now matching it. Now, this period has been like that earlier period on the back of increases in primary product prices. So cash crops, primary products, mining, mineral prices have gone up. Both of these are a lot due to the demand in Asia. So that increase in demand has pushed up this growth. And so in fact, Africa as a whole did not see a downturn in this last crisis, right? It didn't see a downturn in the sense of negative growth. The growth fell to about 2%, but it was still positive growth during the period, and it's now kicked back. It's between 4 and 5% already. So Africa has been coming out of the crisis faster. So in that context, are things going to change since we're seeing this growth? And the argument, I think, coming out of the simulations is that the scale of employment increases in the formal sector is not sufficient to change what Africa looks like, right? One, inequality will only be reduced by a very small bit, right? And the small size of the formal sector does not allow it to sustain a broad welfare, so to say, set of programs, a broad human capital program. So changing the welfare of Africans is going to have to be done with more than simply growth, even extremely rapid growth. And that's because of the existing inequality. Okay? So my conclusions, which are not the end of the talk, just the beginning, is basically what I've just said in terms of growth not producing sufficient jobs, the wage repression. Just a word of note that the youth will be most affected. And again, I've noted 50% of many of these populations are youth. And, you know, these are folks who are ready to be mobilized to do other things if they don't get formal employment. And you've already started seeing it in many African countries where they're being mobilized into kind of criminal, into criminal activity. There will also be regional and sex differences, and these are likely to grow. And there's going to be an impact on ethnic differences, okay? Coming out of this work, it's also clear that we need much better data, and for the economists, we can talk later about the kind of studies we would prefer to do than this kind of study in looking at inequality over time. But given this, what kind of change would we want in African countries? And the kind of change I imagine that most African countries want is something like this, something that's depicted by the kind of change that occurred in South Korea. And this is 1960 to 2006. This is actually the change in rural income, right? Taking the rural folks as the largest part of this reserve army, and looking at how their income went up as GDP changed from being around 15% manufacturing to 45% manufacturing, okay? And what you get is telling. As GDP went up in manufacturing, incomes in the rural area went up, right? And this was because manufacturing was drawing a lot of people out of the rural areas, okay? So it was drawing a lot of people out of the rural areas, right? So diminishing the supply of labor in the rural areas, and therefore forcing the wages up in that sector. And, you know, we almost have now it's almost backward bending, right? That, in fact, here at this point, it's going straight up practically, right? If any small increase in manufacturing means huge increases for rural wages. Not quite the same period, but for the period that we have data for, look at what's happening to the Gini in South Korea. It goes up slightly, right? It goes up from about 34% to, on average, right? And these are different surveys, to about 38%. So there's a slight increase in inequality, okay? Other countries that have gone through this same change, Finland and Taiwan, and there, in fact, you see the measures of inequality, right, falling. So these are the kind of changes one might hope for in Africa. If you think of what kind of process of industrialization would you like to see, one that kind of emulates South Korea, Taiwan, Finland, where a lot of the benefits to the growth have been distributed broadly, okay? The question is, what policies can we follow to try and get there? What policies can we follow to move from where we are to getting to the point that Finland and Taiwan, etc., got to? Okay, so the first group of policies are things we just have to cover, which has to do with measurement, and finding better data, okay? So this is stuff that, we need better data to do this in a more careful manner. Let me get to the more interesting stuff. Along with that, along with actually doing the stuff that economists like doing, we also have to seriously take this idea of figuring out how do we deal with sex as women join the labor force. What kind of rules are in place? What kind of assistance is in place to ensure that actually increases of women in the labor force working outside the house does not lead to diminishing of the returns of those women working outside the house, okay? The one big thing that we can start with that can start to change this is we need to start thinking of labor-intensive policies, and as a kickoff, labor-intensive public policies. Remember earlier on we pointed out a characteristics of particularly the rural sector is that it has very poor infrastructure. So one way to begin to start using this large amount of labor is actually begin to use this large amount of labor to increase rural infrastructure, rural roads, rural irrigation, right? Africa, only 4% of land in Africa is irrigated, okay? The rest of agriculture is rain-fed. Okay, so that alone would be a big way to begin to increase employment. And the good thing about this is that it would be relatively cheap, because if you were paying what is the going wage, what people would get, it would not be that expensive, but it would give people an opportunity, and it would also mean that the other folks around would benefit. So better road means that people can get their produce to market cheaper, in better quality, etc. Then we need a set of policies that actually addresses the structural problems in African economies, both in the rural areas and in the urban areas. Okay? Now, here is a caveat here. This again, particularly the first one, is going to be different depending on what economy you're in, okay? So some countries have highly unequal land distribution, others don't. But for a large number of African countries, one of the big problems is unequal land distribution. So I mentioned earlier on that, the average Kenyan rural household has access to 2.5 acres, okay? Existing alongside this, right, are people who farm literally by plane, okay? So people who have upwards of 100,000 acres of land, okay? There's a ranch, the Galana Ranch in Kenya, which is 3,000 square kilometers, okay? So you have juxtapositioned against these small parcels of land, these huge plantations, these huge estates. And particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa, this is a common characteristic. So one of the things that needs to occur is actually one way to change many African countries is land distribution, right? Now, often when land distribution is mentioned, whose name comes up? Mugabe. Yeah, everybody says Mugabe. So are you suggesting that we do what Mugabe is doing? And I say yes, but I remind people there's Mugabe 1 and Mugabe 2, right? That there was actually land redistribution in Zimbabwe straight after independence from 1980 to 1989, which went on in an orderly manner, which led to a tenfold increase in agricultural production. That, in fact, the period when Zimbabwe became the so-called breadbasket of Southern Africa. It wasn't the period before. It was during that period when Mugabe engaged in an orderly land distribution, somewhat willing buyer, willing seller. And for political reasons, this collapses with the imposition of structural adjustment, the refusal of Britain to continue, because part of this deal was Britain agreed that it would participate in providing funds for this to take place, so that you have this rather than a reclaiming of the land by Africans, of their own land by Africans. So Britain would agree to participate by providing funds for this. And for various reasons that fell apart, right? And along with structural adjustment and the slowdown in the world economy, you then got veterans pushing for land redistribution. And you got Mugabe outflanked, so-called, or to the left by the veterans. And so he imposes a rapid redistribution to retake the political impetus. Okay? So it's not that land redistribution I'm talking about. I'm talking about the earlier form of land distribution. Okay? And I think in many places, actually, there is space for this to occur. There is space because in the past, in many African countries, land has been held because it's been a very good hedge against inflation. But increasingly, as markets have progressed and you have other avenues for investment, increasingly the younger generation are no longer as attached to the land for purposes of holding wealth as the older generation, and are therefore more willing in an organized manner for some kind of land redistribution to take place. Okay? The beauty of land redistribution, which occurs, right, which was central to South Korea's growth, Taiwan's, I would argue Japan's, China's now, right, which many of you know, right, who pushed for land distribution in South Korea and Taiwan especially? Yeah, the US government, right? The same government which is now pushes this idea of private property rights being sacrosanct, pushed for land distribution in those cases because it knew that if it didn't push for land distribution, that there would be a base for the communists and socialists, and therefore went to the front and pushed for land distribution, right? And one of the impacts of land distribution is actually you start creating a rural middle income community who can demand these basic goods, who can demand services. So you actually increase the demand for goods and services which can be produced in the country, in that way increasing the growth of industry and increasing incomes for other people. The second point that I think that we could do presently is much of Africa, or many parts of Africa, given the increases in demand for land, have had a lot of environmental degradation, okay? And so there's a need to do, in many places, environmental reclamation. Again, you know, in the same sense that was done in this country during the Great Depression, reforestation, right? An environmental civilian corps. You could employ people, and today using the carbon tax credits which exist, whereby, you know, countries can actually get money for, you know, absorbing carbon, right? Using that as a way to fund it, you could begin to improve the welfare of rural people and also improve the future prospects for the country. And here a focus on, you know, arid and semi-arid areas and degraded areas. You know, the whole Sahel region could benefit from a plan that has at its core rural environmental conservation. So these are two big things which, between the two of them, cover many African countries that can be done in the rural areas. In the urban areas, there are a couple of things you can do. One is much of Africa is actually housing deficient, right? So most people are living in substandard housing, okay? producing new housing, producing affordable housing in urban areas, and depending on a labor-intensive process which uses local resources, right, would be a way to go forward. The big thing here is the lack of the ability of people to finance their housing. The reason that most people have been housing deficient is that it actually, for most people in Africa, to build a house, you actually have to save your entire amount or build your house bit by bit as you save it. So the financial markets, other than for the very rich, do not actually have mortgages, right? Nor is there a large public housing sector. But if we move to a situation where we pushed for increased housing and combine this housing with locally grown new technologies. So simple things like, for example, mandating that people use solar water heaters, right? Meaning not the sophisticated kind even of where you have solar panels generating electricity, but solar water heaters that just depend on the sun, which are fairly cheap to produce. If you mandate that, with a stroke of a pen, literally, you create an industry. Okay? You create an industry. So you can do that, and this is something, using urban housing was something that Singapore did very well. And what they did here was they used pensions. There were forced savings where the government, took out pensions from people from their salaries, but they allowed you to use these pension savings as the basis of acquiring housing. Okay? And so they used that to seed the growth of proper housing. The other part is upgraded what's called the juakali, or the informal sector. The informal sector, as I've noted, is this area where people go to do things when they don't have jobs in the formal sector. Now, often some of these people are very skilled, right? So you'll have, let's say, carpenters working in small workshops, but don't have access to markets, to larger markets. Okay, so what is needed there is really a huge support from the government to create an infrastructure that allows people to put their goods in the formal market. Now, let me give you a quick example. This follows actually in the example that you find with Japan, South Korea again, Taiwan, in which they had these ministries of trade and industrialization, which played an extremely important role in both organizing industry. But one unappreciated role they played is a role they played in actually helping exports. It actually requires a lot of human capital, a lot more human capital, to understand export markets than often producing the actual good, right? Understanding what the export market needs is often difficult. Putting together the resources to export is often difficult. So one can create a structure, and here I use an African example, KTDA, which was the Kenya Tea Development Authority. And in 1964, when Kenya got its independence, all tea was produced on plantations. Africans were not allowed to produce tea till the late 50s, early 60s. They were all small tea growers, okay? So 80–90% of tea was produced on plantations because you needed a factory with each plantation for tea processing. The Kenya government decided it needed to create a rural middle class, all right, to give it support. And it was really a political decision. And it went to the World Bank and asked for money to get a government corporation to help Africans produce tea. And the World Bank refused. And it said, we'll give you money for other things. And the Kenyan government, for once in its life, insisted and said, we really want this. Okay? And they actually created this Tea Development Authority, which created the factories for a large number of smallholders. And the Kenya Tea Development Authority not only managed to get smallholders involved in tea, it defined how tea was processed. So the common way that it's done now, which is called CTC, cut, treated, and cured, was something that came out of this organization, okay? And beyond that, it also became an instrument of rural development, because this organization built roads because it needed to get to the tea. It expanded tea planting. And so it went from where no Africans were producing tea to where today Kenya, depending on which year you look at it, is the largest exporter of black tea, or the second largest after Sri Lanka, right? And 75% of this tea comes from smallholders. So from producing very little, they are producing this huge amount of tea. And they are the somewhat wealthy group in the rural areas. So you need a similar process with the informal sector. Quick example, furniture makers. There's wonderful furniture that comes out of different parts of Africa. You just need to look on the web and find galleries in New York City which is selling Africa furniture. I can give you an example of beds that come out of Lamu which sell in New York City at $6,000. Okay? $6,000. Tables selling at the same amount. These in Kenya leave at $400 or $500. Right? So they leave in Kenya at $400 or $500 and arriving in New York City at $6,000, right? Now, the person who's selling it in Lamu doesn't have the capability of transporting it and marketing it in the US, right? They don't have the knowledge, right? The cost is actually not very high. Shipping a container from Mombasa to New York City is only $2,000. So you sell one bed, you've covered your transportation costs, right? And you can fit easily over 20 beds in one container. Okay? So it's a question of how do you build that kind of infrastructure, right? And that's a role that we need to have governments play. Lastly, we need, coming back to the gap between wage and profit shares, I think there are a number of things that need to be done. One is, you know, the profit share becoming larger becomes a problem when this profit is not distributed amongst a large part of the population. So when it's single owners. But if you create actual institutions like the KTDA, which is a farmer-owned organization, where these profits are then owned by these producers, then you will get that even if the profit share increases to some extent, if it's going to cooperative type firms, worker-owned firms, or community-owned firms, then it will ameliorate to some extent this increase in inequality. And last, you need to improve the taxation system in many African countries. Many African countries depend on taxing sales and trade, right? And so there's a need to really actually put in place a good income tax system that, that can be progressive, okay? Let me leave you with this. You know, inequality reduction, and this comes back to the moral question that I had mentioned earlier that, you know, Derrick was particularly interested in. It's not only an economic action, right? In fact, it's also political. And it is important because creating a nation, which many African countries have not done. They are countries, they have boundaries, but they're not a nation. Creating a nation actually requires that individuals in that nation feel that they have a fair chance of being successful. And you don't get that feeling when you're in a highly unequal society, right? You know that it's highly unlikely that you will reach the tops of that society. So it is actually an important national project for many African countries. And I would argue that in many ways it would lower instability in many regions of Africa, which in turn then, of course, leads to even better growth. And lastly, of course, happy citizens. I'll take questions if you're not yet asleep. Yes.
Thanks. That was really interesting. And being from another discipline, you know, even though I am, I could follow it, and I feel it's very kind of hopeful and utopian. But I had these kind of pessimistic thoughts running through my mind, and I'm just going to mention them because I think that in order to, and they have to do with implementation of your ideas, which seem very tenable. And I know more about the Dominican Republic, and it's probably very different, but I'm going to say something very general that I think you could probably apply to many countries. That in the Dominican Republic, and probably through most of the world, as grossly unjust as the economy is, it serves the interests of the transnational corporations and of the local elite. So in other words, from their point of view, it's working very well, and there's no reason to change it. And those are the people that are in the position to change it. So as good as your suggestions sound, really like they could work. It's just that how couldn't we ever implement them if the people that are in positions to implement them have no motivation to do it?
Okay. That's completely a fair question. 20 years ago, I would have told you, well, a few of us need to get some AK-47s. You need to have a revolution. A Patriot Act doesn't allow me to say that nowadays, so I actually didn't say that, okay? But I want to qualify what you just said about the ruling elites. In fact, it is true, yes, and I said this earlier on, that there are many ruling elites that benefit from the system. But we've also gone through 50 years of crises in these countries, okay? And one of the things that occurs is that, as Rockefeller once said, I would gladly give up half my wealth to save the other half. There's a realization, there's a beginning realization, at least amongst portions of the elite, and this is one of the things that has to occur, that in fact, to keep enjoying this fantastic lifestyle, we have to give somewhere, right? The Kenyan elite, straight after independence, realized they had to give somewhere in terms of creating a somewhat middle-income rural sector, okay, in order to ensure stability. I think the repeated instability in many African countries has gotten at least a group of the elites thinking about this. I was struck in 2007. I gave a talk which I normally don't give. I was going home, I was on the plane, and I run into a friend of mine who we were in high school together. This guy is a managing partner of KPMG, okay, in Kenya. He's just coming back from Brazil, where he had gone to recruit, right? He had been in New York and Brazil recruiting Kenyans who had left, trying to bring them back to KPMG in Nairobi. And so we are talking, and he says, oh yeah, we're doing our normal budget day presentation, and they have this elaborate budget day dinner where they they analyze the budget after it's produced. So there's this tradition in Commonwealth countries where the budget is officially read on one day, and what the government intends to do over the next year. And so in the evening, they analyze what are the implications of budget for basically their customers, who are all the quote-unquote captains of industry. And he said, why don't you come and give a talk? And I said, well, sure, okay, I'll come and give a talk. And so I end up at this talk where the person, it's made up of a representative from the Ministry of Finance, who is the Assistant Minister of Finance then. Now, the present Prime Minister, and of course KPMG were going to talk about the tax issues. And he puts me on first. So I say to them, okay, look, I can't talk to you about taxes. I know nothing about taxes. I know nothing about budget. So I'm not going to be value added in that sense, right? And you've got politicians and tax accountants to talk about that, right? And they're going to make you happy because the politicians will say, we'll cut your taxes, and the tax accountants will show you how to get out of any new taxes. So I said, I'll talk to you about inequality. And I focused on land distribution. And I was actually surprised by how little, in fact, only one person who comes from the Kenyatta family, who's the first president of the country and have vast land holdings. He was the only person who I know who actually objected to the issue. Most people were more concerned about, is there a way that you can do this in a reasonable manner? And most of them realized the shortcoming of the problem that existed in the country at that point. Right? Now, I'm not saying that that translates into it occurring, but I'm saying there is a little more space. Okay, in 1980, you couldn't have this discussion. Right? In 1980, you couldn't say land distribution. Right? Now there's discussion about it. There's discussion in the political sphere about land distribution, and there's an acknowledgement that there's a huge inequality and something has to be done about it. So we've moved one step. Now I'm not saying that tomorrow, it will be solved, but I think there's a need. I think there's signs in Africa where we can be more optimistic about some things. Right? It still needs a lot of work. Right? It requires people to go in and reinforce this message and to agitate for it. But I think it's not as hopeless as it once seemed. No?
I have a question actually about, you gave the example of the beds being exported here, and you need the human capital to do that, and you have a lot of expatriates that have moved to the U.S. or Europe,
yeah.
And they often are the ones that have some of that human capital to do that, but in order to go back to Kenya or to Cameroon or wherever, they're faced with an issue where there are taxes, and there are things that make it difficult for them to have the lifestyle that they would want to have if they engage in business without being somehow corrupted, or they would have to avoid some of these taxes in illegal ways.
No, I mean, you don't have to avoid. People are avoiding taxes in illegal ways often because you want to make a bigger cut. Not because it means that you're getting, a 50% profit rate rather than a 20% profit rate. Now, if you can land a bed in New York at $6,000 and sell it at $6,000, which you bought for $500 to $800, tax me at 50%. I'll gladly pay that tax rate, right? So the gaps are so large. I mean, and you can look at a variety of things, right? You look at the cost of a pound of coffee in Ethiopia, right? What the farmer gets, and what Starbucks at the end generates out of that pound of coffee, right? And the gap is huge, right? So it's figuring out how to capture this ground and capture some of that income, not necessarily all, but some of that income for African producers. That will change a lot of the situation. Now, you're right, a lot of that knowledge is actually to be found in expatriates who are here. And some of them are beginning to do this. So you'll often see many of the very successful new African firms being led. In fact, elsewhere I've argued that Africa is seeing today what it saw post the Second World War. Post the Second World War, Africa saw a huge return of, well, it wasn't a return in the sense of a voluntary, but all the soldiers who had fought in the Second World War on behalf of the Allies returned. And they returned with a lot of knowledge, a new view of the world. And these are the folks who became union leaders, the folks who led the struggle for independence. And so they were that first generation of African leaders for these new countries. In the same way today, you are seeing a huge return, a relatively large return of African individuals who have done relatively well. right, who are able to do some of this and who are in a position to do.
Begin living in both places.
Yeah, and be able to begin living in both places. So again, I mean, not that it's nirvana, but you're beginning to see the beginnings of this kind of activity taking place. And also, you know, the West is becoming less friendly for African immigrants. So they're having to find other ways to survive. So that's leading to some of this. The third part of this is actually the rates of return on investment are extremely high in Africa. So, and a lot of expatriates realize this. So, you know, if you have your money, for example, in most African stock markets, over the last 15 years, people have been minted money. In other areas, let's say like telecommunications, the returns are extremely high. I mean, we're talking about 25% per annum rates on invested capital, which is huge. Other questions, shout outs before?
I was wondering what's the role of urbanization in contributing to inequality nowadays in developing countries? Because often we see, in most cases of developing countries, economic growth is accompanied by urbanization, the increase in urbanization.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times, the end result of urbanization is you see migration from other cities to major cities, which would bring a large population into the informal sector, which then, as you reasoned, would provide a reserve labor force, and then further create inequality. So what exactly does urbanization do?
Right. So one of the things is what you've just said. You have previously in the 1960s, African cities, for the most part, were relatively equal, or were much more equal than they are now. Now what you get is large slums, large areas of very low income. So in fact, what you've ended up with is a very volatile urban situation. So that's one of the things that's occurring is that you're getting a very volatile urban situation. It's increasing insecurity in urban areas, which in turn means it decreases economic activity in urban areas. I think that's the biggest part of what you're getting out of in terms of inequality in urban situations. Yes, Linus?
In terms of implementing the proposals you put forward, do you see any problems with institutional setup, for example?
So you're saying with the capabilities of
existing institutions?
Yeah, no, I mean, what it's going to require, these things are not going to occur overnight in different countries. It's going to change, right? So it will require some changes in institutional setup. I mean, one thing that we can look at with some hope, despite also issues, is, for example, how rapidly Rwanda has been able to change and create an institutional setup that has done a number of these kinds of things, right? And change the lives of many rural and urban Rwandans. It has its own problems. I'm not trying to make it, again, you can point out problems with it, but that has been done, right? So I think it's possible that, you know, in bits, right? I think an important part of this is African countries need to turn back to their own histories, right? And not import institutional setups from outside. If you look within most African countries, you can find successful institutions. The question is then not to look outside for institutions to import, but look internally at those institutions that are successful and then see how do you implement them, right? Eileen was in Lagos this last month. I believe she can now get to the airport from any part of Lagos in 50 minutes, an hour, something that used to 2 years ago, 3 years ago, took 4-5 hours, right? So there's been an improvement somewhat an improvement in Lagos, which has occurred given some things that the present governor of Lagos has done. Now, part of the failing here is it's not clear whether institutions themselves are changing, right, to be able to continue that once this guy is out. But it's clear that there's some things that can be done, and I think a lot of it has to do with looking at our successes. Then we'll give Bill the last question as...
Is the whole matter of human capital extremely important here? You really can't get just lack of more equality unless you have a better education system. And isn't that one of the big problems in Africa?
It is one of the big problems, but it's also, we're very different from 1960s. You know, there's a lot of talk about human capital, but you know, Linus, my replacement here, and I have to note that he's a much better looking replacement. So you've done well. But one of the things is, you know, there's not only Derrick here. So, you know, a large number of us are outside, have left, right? You know, the figure I gave you on unemployment, you look at that, and mostly it's folks who are coming out of university, right? So human capital is a problem for many African countries, but I think it's in very specific areas. It's not human capital broadly. I think right now a bigger problem is figuring out how do you channel folks who have a fair amount of human capital into productive activities. How do you, for example, use universities so universities cease being simply academic degree granting institutions, but also end up producing folks who produce jobs, right? So that's a bigger area that needs to be tackled. In a sense, what I would advocate is Africa needs to take a step back, audit its resources, and then think about these policies in terms of the resources it has available. And I would argue a careful look at its own resources would find that it can do a lot of this by itself, right? That those resources do exist. They're often overlooked.